Hello everyone. Today we're going to return our attention to the history of the medieval papacy, looking at selected popes during a 300-year period from around 800 to around 1100. Before we move into our study, however, I want to call your attention to this painting. This is a fresco that is located on the wall of the Sistine Chapel. It was painted during the medieval era around 1480 by Pietro Perugino. And obviously you can see the central focus of this painting is the delivery of the keys of the kingdom to St. Peter. And so we see Jesus and Peter here, the keys of the kingdom. And so I've titled this lecture Upon This Rock because for the Roman Catholic Church, Peter is the rock upon which the church is built. But notice that these biblical figures in very colorful dress are set in a medieval period. All right, so we have medieval attire and architecture and a very distinctly Renaissance painting combining biblical figures and medieval culture. All right, the last pope that we looked at was Gregory the First, also known as Gregory the Great. And so this is about 200 years later. Leo the Third. All right, notice that this pope took on the name of Leo the First. We actually will see 4 different popes by the name Leo because the first Leo was so significant, so great, so admired that later popes wanted to take his name for themselves. You may wonder, why do popes take on papal names? Well, this is a practice that began in 535 when the Bishop of Rome was elected, and he had the name Mercurius. Well, he didn't believe that it was appropriate for the Bishop of Rome to have the name of a pagan god like Mercury. And so he took upon himself the name John. He was the second Bishop of Rome by that name, and so history remembers him as John the Second. And so from then on, it became a tradition for each new pope to take on a new name. And so we're going to see several popes who take on the name Leo because of the fame of the first great Leo, Bishop of Rome. All right, Leo the Third is known best because he is the one who crowned Charlemagne as the emperor of the Holy Roman Empire, and he did so on Christmas Day 800. Now, Leo had been attacked by some unknown adversaries who had tried to blind him, attempted to cut out his tongue. Fortunately, they were stopped before they could succeed. But nonetheless, in this position of injury and weakness, Leo went to the north to seek out help from Charles the Great, Charlemagne, who is now the king of the Franks. And so Leo invited Charles to come to Rome, and there, as Charlemagne was worshiping on Christmas Day, as he rose from his kneeling position, Leo placed the crown on his head and proclaimed him emperor of the Romans. All right. Later on, Leo's kingdom expanded to be a great empire, as we have seen, and historians refer to it as the Holy Roman Empire. And this action allied the papacy and the empire, thereby bringing about once more the union of church and state. And in this case, the church was protected by the empire. All right, the next significant pope is about a half a century later, Nicholas I, and he is known for asserting papal supremacy by appealing to a series of documents that he believed to be true, and yet history determined that they were forgeries, and therefore they called them the false decretals. Included in these documents were the donation of Constantine and the pseudo-Isidorian decretals. Okay, what are we talking about here? The Isidorian decretals were falsely attributed to one of the great bishops in recent history, Isidore of Seville. And these decretals declared that the Pope had spiritual authority over others in the church and then also over secular leaders. The donation of Constantine was equally important in a more material way, and that is they declared that Constantine, as Emperor of Rome, had donated to Pope Sylvester the city of Rome and the surrounding territory. And this was the rationale given to the Pope for his claim to control over the papal states as well as the city of Rome. All of this was a donation to the papacy by Emperor Constantine himself. And so Nicholas I is asserting great authority for the papacy based on these false, forged documents. But they were believed to be true for a number of centuries later. Well, as you know, I like to tell stories, and this is a fun one, and perhaps you have heard rumors about Pope Joan. These rumors began in a 13th century legend claiming that in the 9th century a woman disguised herself as a man and then climbed the ecclesiastical ranks to actually become the Pope. She was exposed as a woman when she gave birth during a papal procession. She actually had to leave the coach. She gave birth in the streets. There are two different stories at this point. One is that she died in childbirth. The other story is that the people were so angry they tied her to the back of a horse, ran her through the streets, and then stoned her to death. Oh my, how gruesome. The legend is that in the aftermath of this experience, all papal processions avoid the intersection where Joan gave birth, and it is said that later papal ceremonies were conducted in such a way to ensure that the Pope is male. All right, this is strictly legendary, created centuries later by someone who was wanting to poke facetious insults at the papacy. But I wonder if this Pope Joan might have been based upon a particular woman named Marozia, an Italian woman with tremendous influence over the papacy during the later 900s. All right, we're going to talk about Marozia and other powerful women in the story of the Pornocracy. All right, so you can see even within the title of this period of time, pornocracy is a time of immorality in the papacy. When the Holy Roman Empire declined following the death of Charlemagne, well, so did the papacy. And political intrigue among rivals led to murder, imprisonment, and other atrocities as men grabbed for the power that was inherent in this office. During the years 904 to 962, there was a series of immoral popes, and these popes came under the influence of licentious noblewomen who were mistresses of the popes. All right, remember, popes took on vows of celibacy, but these popes paid no attention to those vows. They were simply words that they spoke in order to achieve this high, powerful, lucrative position. The most powerful of these women was named Marozia. She was the mistress of Sergius III, who reigned from 904 to 911, thus beginning this period of the Pornocracy. Marozia influenced the elections of two popes after Sergius. One was their illegitimate son, who became John the 11th, and he reigned from 931 to 935, and during his reign, he turned the papal palace into a brothel, all right, where prostitutes were housed, providing him all kinds of sexual exploits. Now, Marozia's grandson became Pope John the 12th, and he reigned from 955 to 964. John the 12th is the one who crowned Otto I as Emperor of the Holy Roman Empire. Do you recall our discussion of the Holy Roman Empire and its revival under the Saxons, Henry the Fowler, and his descendant, who is Otto I? And John the 12th followed the pattern of Leo III, and he crowned Otto I as the Holy Roman Emperor, but then Otto turned around and deposed John, recognizing that that John was an illegitimate pope, and so Otto took it upon himself to reform the papacy, and so he and his successors dominated the elections of many popes. All right, and so although we might deplore a secular leader appointing the pope, nonetheless, at least with a reforming ideal in mind, these emperors selected popes that acted more appropriately than the popes did during this 60-year period of the Pornocracy. Now, in 1048, the next century, Leo the Ninth becomes the Pope, appointed by Henry III, the current emperor of the Holy Roman Empire. But instead of simply accepting his appointment by the emperor, Leo decided to walk barefoot into Rome in order to be elected by the people. And so he demonstrated his humility, and he received appointment by acclamation by the people. He was accompanied by friends Humbert and Hildebrand, about whom we will have much to say in the history of the medieval papacy during this era. He began what is known as the Gregorian Reform, and so even though he began the reform, it's named after his successor, Pope Gregory the Seventh. Now, Leo required celibacy for the clergy, even down to the level of subdeacon. Okay, so he demanded that clergy be celibate. He refused them to marry and to bear children. He also banned simony. As you know, this is the purchase of clerical offices. One reason why Leo and like-minded reformers banned clerical marriage is that they feared that clerical positions would become inherited, so that as clergy had families, their sons then would claim clerical offices based on their inheritance. And he wanted the clergy to demonstrate a spiritual call, all right, and a willingness to serve their people out of a spiritual desire to serve people's needs, rather than inheriting these positions from their parents. All right, and so this was a high calling for Leo. Now, his reign, unfortunately, led to the schism between the Eastern Church and the Western Church, and so we'll turn our attention to that event now. Let's begin by talking about the differences between the Western and Eastern Catholic churches. All right, there's a different culture. In the West, they are dominated by a German worldview, whereas in the Eastern Church, they still maintain a Greek philosophical worldview. Their languages are different. In the West, they speak Latin. In the East, they speak Greek. And so their languages symbolize the differences between these two churches. The church government is different. In the West, they're ruled by a papal monarchy. Remember, there's only one archbishopric in the West, and that is the Bishop of Rome. And so he rules in the West. In the East, however, there were three archbishoprics: Constantinople, Antioch, and Alexandria. And these three share spiritual authority, and their decisions are made in councils. All right, so a very different kind of church government. Now, the East accepts only the first 7 ecumenical councils, those that we looked at earlier this semester: Nicaea, Constantinople, Ephesus, Chalcedon, the second and third councils of Constantinople, and then the second council of Nicaea. In the West, there are a number of councils that take place in Rome at the Lateran Cathedral, and the West certainly follows the decisions made by the Lateran councils in Rome, but not the church in the East. Now, serious differences in the clergy in the West and East. In the West, as we've said, the expectation is clerical celibacy. Not always followed, as we have seen, but nonetheless, this was the pattern, and especially under Leo IX and his like-minded reformers. Clerical celibacy is insisted upon. But in the East, family life is allowed for local parish clergy. In other words, a priest can be married and have a family. Now, in the Eastern Church, a married man cannot be promoted to a bishop or a higher clerical position, but nonetheless, the local parishes can be led by priests who are family men. Now, there's an important theological difference because of the change made in the Nicene Creed. All right, we talked about this briefly before, the West added the filioque clause in reference to the Holy Spirit. You'll remember that the Nicene Creed stated originally that the Holy Spirit proceeded from the Father, but the Western Church added the filioque clause, saying that the Holy Spirit proceeded from the Father and the Son. I explained that the reason for this addition is that when the Aryan tribes came from east to the west for the first time, Western church fathers had to deal with Arianism and this idea that Jesus is less than God. And so in order to emphasize Jesus' equality with God the Father, they made the statement that the Spirit proceeds from both the Father and the Son. All right, now theologically, the East disagreed with this statement, but most important, they resented the fact that the West made this change in an ecumenical creed without consulting the Eastern Church. And so they felt like they had been separated and isolated from the West through this decision. So as a result, the West abandoned the Nicene Creed and returned to the Apostles' Creed. Now, worship was different. In the West, they sprinkle in baptism, but in the East, they continue to practice triple immersion, even of infants, which scares me to death, but nonetheless, they practice triple immersion in their baptism. How many of you have seen the movie My Big Fat Greek Wedding? All right, it was a sleeper film from a number of years ago. It's a great romantic comedy, but in the story, there is a Greek young woman who becomes engaged to a non-Greek fella. All right, and this fella loves her so much he's willing to convert to Greek Orthodoxy and submits to baptism, and they actually show the baptism on screen. I'm so amazed. And indeed, he is immersed 3 times as part of the baptismal response. All right, so if you haven't seen it, I recommend it. It's good fun. Okay. The Lord's Supper also was performed differently in the East and the West. In the West, they provided only the bread to the laity, whereas in the East, they gave both the bread and the cup. Why the difference? Well, we will talk more about the Catholic doctrine of transubstantiation, the doctrine that the bread and the wine literally transubstantiate into the body and blood of Christ. But with this idea in mind, the priest would not give the wine to the layperson for fear that the layperson might mishandle the cup and spill some of the wine, thereby wasting the blood of Christ. This was not a concern in the East, and yet it was in the West. And we're going to find that the Reformers are very critical of the Catholic Church for giving only one element in the Lord's Supper. Now, let me hasten to say that in the 1960s at Vatican II, the Catholic Church changed this policy, and today they give both the bread and the cup to lay people. But at any rate, in the 11th century, this is a major difference and point of contention between the East and West. Now, we've already talked about the use of statues in the West. Both the West and the East agreed to the use of images in worship. But in the West, they allowed not only paintings but statues. But oh no, not in the East. They allowed only the two-dimensional icons. And so another point of contention between these two geographical churches. Well, there was another conflict of a much more practical nature, and this came about with the mission to the Slavic peoples. All right, in between the West and the East, there was this region of the Slavic tribe, and they became interested in Christianity, and so missions came to the Slavs from both the West and the East. From the East, the brothers Cyril and Methodius had a tremendous influence on the Slavic peoples. In fact, they created the alphabet by which they could write out a translation of the Bible. And so even today, the Roman alphabet is known as the Cyrillic alphabet, named for Cyril. Because of their efforts in the 9th century, in the 10th century, Russians in Kiev were converted to Christianity, and then Moscow later is going to become the third Rome when Constantinople fell to the Muslims in 1453. All right, so we have a tremendous mission effort from the East to the Slavic peoples. Well, also Benedictine missions from the Roman Church into Poland. And so which patterns are the Slavic Christians going to follow, Western or Eastern? Ultimately, they chose the Eastern Church, but again, more conflict developed. And so, in 1054, Leo of Ohrid, he's the archbishop in Bulgaria, accused the West of heresy, partly because the Western Church required clerical celibacy. Leo IX, who's an advocate of reform, and because of his tremendous concern about clerical celibacy and its necessity in order to prevent an inherited clerical position, he sent his friend Cardinal Humbert as his ambassador. Remember, Humbert accompanied Leo barefoot into Rome. Unfortunately, Humbert is no diplomat, and so he does not come with an open mind. Humbert was a crusader. He was totally opposed to married clergy, as was his friend Leo. He also was opposed to state authority over the church, all right, ignoring the alliance of church and state in the West. Nonetheless, in the East, the Eastern emperor is still sitting on the throne and had authority over the church. And so Humbert was opposed to this as well. And so Humbert decided that there was no reconciliation between the two. And so while the patriarchal bishop of Constantinople, who was Michael Cerularius, while he celebrated the Mass in the Hagia Sophia, the great cathedral in the East, Humbert walked in, laid a sentence of anathema on the altar, thereby excommunicating him. The story is that a deacon saw Humbert do this, and knowing what was going on, he grabbed the papal sentence of anathema and chased after Humbert. Humbert simply shook the dust off his feet, left the cathedral, and the deacon just kind of dropped the anathema on the floor. All right, but nonetheless, the damage was done. And so what started off with Leo of Ohrid, the Bulgarian archbishop, excommunicating the West, now the West has laid a sentence of anathema on the East, and so there is division between the West and the East. Now, Leo died only a month later, and some historians suspect that Humbert is the author of this sentence of anathema, but there's no confirmation of that. So, the Great Schism of the Western Roman Church and the Eastern Orthodox Church resulted in part from opposition from the East against the papal monarchy of Leo IX. And so the blame lays both with the West and with the East. Perhaps it is at this point in history that we can begin speaking in terms of the Roman Catholic Church headed in Rome and governing the western half of Europe. And on the other hand, we can talk about the Eastern Orthodox Church with the capital in Constantinople, but other major archbishoprics in Antioch, Alexandria, and even other regions in the East. But nonetheless, here we have these two great churches separated in 1054. As we said, as we entered into our study of the medieval era, this is one of the momentous milestones in the history of the medieval church. Not a high point, okay, but a milestone. And so I'm going to choose this time to put a pause in this lesson, and we'll pick up with our study of the medieval papacy in another lesson. All right, so hang in with me. I'll be back very soon.